Hi, I'm David Birchall and I'm doing the lecture pods as well as being the unit coordinator for Australian politics and active citizenship for week 3 in spring. This is the topic on Australia's electoral democracy. This is the second of 2 lecture pods. As you can see, this is a companion pod to the first pod that hopefully you've already seen. If not, go and see it before you listen and watch this one. There, look back at the history of democracy in the ancient world and prior to the 20th century, and then the emergence of modern Australian democracy and what makes it distinctive and almost unique in the world. In this pod, I will look at just in more detail about the mechanics and the technicalities of different voting systems and why ours is different from most people's. And there's the same images from the first pod that you'll recall. William Hogarth's famous series of paintings about and prints and engravings about an election in 18th century England, very different from ours today, because apart from anything else, it wasn't conducted in secret. You voted in open and the candidates could see how you'd voted. There was nothing to stop them from taking reprisals against you. And bottom right hand corner, the system that emerged over the 20th century in Australia, but pre-existed in the Australian colonies of secret voting in little polling booths created for that purpose. In those days, they seemed to be made of plywood. That's, as you can probably tell, during World War II. Nowadays, they tend to be big cardboard boxes. So I call this all votes are not equal because, as I'm about to explain, all voting systems are to some extent what social scientists would call an artifact. So Brian Costar, in his reading up on views for this week, points out that once you get beyond the simplest and most, if you like, primitive forms of voting in electoral democracy, thus such as if we're all in a room and we all make a show of hands, anything larger and more than elaborate than that requires some kind of voting system, and all kinds of voting systems involve some kind of mechanism by which votes are measured and weighted, and some votes necessarily get treated in different ways to others. In a show of hands where you've only got 2 options, that's simple. In a show of hands where you've got 3 options, suddenly things get much more complicated because and it's not necessarily the case that if you put up a show of hands for each one of the 3 options in order, that a majority of people will necessarily pick one of those options. That's where it all begins, I guess, in terms of the problems of electoral systems. How to make an electoral system that covers a number of different bases at once. How can you create an electoral system that attempts to represent the wills of voters while the outcomes also, hopefully, represent some kind of popular will and hopefully provide governments with some sort of what we'd like to call mandate, though that's not a word you'll find in the Australian Constitution. So all voting systems are artifacts. They're a kind of machinery created, designed to harness and reflect some conception of the popular will, but they do it in different ways. They all have advantages and disadvantages, and the advantages and disadvantages tell you something about the idea of democracy that underlies them, and also I think why they become so controversial. The Athenian system I talked about in the previous lecture pod was simple in one regard. It simply took the people as being, for these purposes of voting, everyone who could make it to the assembly space on that particular occasion, which might have meant, for instance, that the Athenian people in any one particular day was actually a quarter of the potential voting population of Athens, or maybe less. There was supposed to be a quorum of 6,000 Athenian citizens. It's not clear whether the quorum was ever precisely counted. Very likely not, for all the reasons you might imagine. It would be time consuming. So the people on one day in the assembly in Athens, and that's a modern historian's depiction of what it might have looked like, the people on one day might have been a different people the next. And so there's a famous example from Thucydides' Peloponnesian War of the Athenian people on one day deciding that they should send off a ship to a rebellious island called Mytilene and massacre the inhabitants, and not that long later the Athenian people regathered, making a different decision. It's not quite clear if they changed their minds or if it's a different people who's voting this time. That didn't matter to the Athenians because there was some kind of idea that they have not carried down to us clearly explained, that you could represent the popular will by the fact that people were physically present, even if most of them weren't. Modern electoral systems aren't like ancient Athenian democracy. They don't involve people voting in person, and most often, other than the case of referenda, they don't involve people making decisions about particular matters of policy or political importance. Rather, people make decisions about who should represent them and make decisions on their behalf. So modern electoral systems, the last dot point there, in large territorial nation states, are designed to elect representatives of the people. But then it becomes important that the representatives of the people can be understood themselves to be representing the popular will and to have been elected out of some manifestation of the popular will. And then in turn, when representatives may become parts of governments, this becomes important so that the governments can be seen as legitimate. And a large part of political debate, I think, in 20th century Australia about voting systems and elections was about that problem. How to make governments appear legitimate and how to give elections the character of the exercise of the popular will. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say Australia worried more about those questions than most countries did over the 20th century, despite the fact that we had the good fortune to have a stable electoral democracy throughout the entire century. Okay, so here's just a rundown of different ways that you can do elections for us to think about in classes next week. That's in week 3. The first voting system is the one I described. If you have a bunch of people in a room and there's a matter at issue you want to resolve, but there's more than one solution, you could ask people to put up their hands in the 18th century. You could ask them to express their view in a public vote, or else you could ask them to do it in a secret ballot, which was actually the way the first Australian elections were carried out. First past the post simply means that people indicate a preference for one of several options. In the case of the election of representatives to parliaments, it means that you choose which of the candidates you want to be elected to parliament. It's the simplest and, in some people's eyes, the cleanest system of elections to representative parliaments. And it's been commonplace in the older democracies like Britain and the United States, although Britain wasn't really a democracy until well into the 20th century. But at least the older representative systems, because it no doubt evolved out of earlier electoral systems, and possibly out of systems that involved raising hands or putting chits in boxes, things like that. So it's very likely the oldest of the modern voting systems. So the advantages are simplicity, transparency, decisive results. Quite quickly, votes can be counted and they will tell you who got elected to fill that vacancy. If you have a system of electorates or seats in Parliament, you can quite quickly work out who was elected to each one of those seats. And it's a mechanism so simple that anyone can understand it without really needing to be taught, because we can do it all at home, as it were. You can have an election of the same kind at home about what you might get as takeaway for dinner. 4 members of the family, 3 options. If two vote for one, then it's got up. The disadvantages of first past the post are equally clear, and I think in the contemporary world across the world, they're really quite striking. It's a winner-takes-all system. Whoever gets the plurality of the votes, whoever gets more votes than anybody else, wins, even if a majority of people didn't vote for them. It's possible to have first past the post systems involving single-member electorates of a system similar to ours, but with first past the post, where a government can be formed with the votes of less than 40% of the people. That's happened in the United Kingdom around about 40%, several times. In fact, possibly a majority of times over the last few decades, since the 1970s, depending on how you count it. Also, first past the post tends to underrepresent minor parties. If you have 2 major parties fighting it out, the minor parties find it quite hard to get any sort of representation in Parliament at all. So, for instance, the Liberal Democratic Party in Britain has quite commonly got more than 20% of the vote in elections, but ended up with hardly any members of Parliament. So it's problematic in those senses. This was the form of election used in Australia in the early decades after Federation. The first Australian Parliament formed in 1901, that rather romanticised image there, I think by Arthur Streeton from 1901, was elected in that fashion. The most common form of electoral system across the world, where electoral systems mean anything, is probably the proportional representation system. It's been used, at least until recently, in most countries in Europe and in a great many countries in the developing world. There are several different versions of it, and some of them get quite complicated. And I'm not going to try and explain the complicated ones here because it would take too long. But in the most common version of the system, people vote for a list of candidates. This is what happens in the Australian Senate. They can either vote in the Australian Senate for the list individually in order, or else they just vote for the list by putting a number at the top. That's a quite common system in European electoral democracies. Then parties get members elected to Parliament, not on the basis of individual electorates, but the percentage of the vote they got. Quite commonly, if there's a list system, by simply going down the list and declaring them elected in the order of the list. The great advantage of proportional representation is that everyone's vote weighs the same as everybody else's, and everyone's vote is counted. If 23% of the electorate vote for a particular party, that party gets 23% of the seats in Parliament. In that respect, you could say it's the most democratic system. However, critics have pointed out numerous disadvantages to the system, and they are less to do with it as a system of election and more to do with it as a system of electing governments. Where party lists are used, often the parties determine the order of the lists and, of course, who goes on the lists. That can be a problem in terms of choice, but it tends to be more of a problem in terms of forming governments, because people get into government because the parties wanted them there rather than because they're necessarily good at the job. And individual electors may not get a chance to decide whether or not they were good at their job. Likewise, governments elected by proportional representation are very commonly coalitions. It tends to fragment the electorate into a range of choices, and you can have as many as half a dozen or maybe more parties in a government. There were coalition governments in Italy in the 1960s and 1970s that had half a dozen different parties, occasionally even more in them. And that could lead to instability, which was notoriously a problem in Italy, or sometimes the reverse, which is another way of explaining the Italian problem, where you simply had the same government going on forever, apparently, but with a never-shifting coalition. In Italy between the 1950s and 1970s, the Christian Democrats headed every single government over that period just by putting together coalitions with a range of minor parties. So it can lead on the one hand to instability, on the other hand to too much stability. Either way, it can lead to corruption. The PR system has been used in Australian upper houses, the federal Senate, the state legislative councils, since the decades after World War II, in the case of the Senate, 1948. But it's been used in a curious way borrowed from the United States Senate. Each Australian state has been given the same number of seats in the Australian Senate, different if it's a territory. And therefore people's votes have counted quite differently according to which state they lived in. The votes of people in Tasmania for the Senate count much more than the votes of people in New South Wales. It's explicitly not a democratic system in the strong sense. Hence, the Australian Senate, like the United States Senate, has often been called a states' house. It represents states rather than representing individuals. Recently, this system of election in the Australian Senate has been criticised because it's capable of being gamed. It's been discovered by clever people, by people with very low levels of support, nominating themselves in very large numbers and cross-preferencing each other in complicated ways. That means that someone like, for instance, someone from the Shooters Party or even the Car Enthusiast Party, in a notorious case in the Australian Federal Senate, can get elected even though they got a tiny number of first preference votes. The preferential system, as it's generally called in Australia, is a third option, not quite unique to Australia, but almost unique, that was developed in the 1920s as a kind of compromise between rival electoral systems, including both the first past the post and the proportional system, along with other variants of the proportional system. In the preferential system as it's developed in Australia and is practiced today, at least in the House of Representatives in Canberra, or for the House of Representatives in Canberra, voters and electorates rank candidates in a numerical order, as on this little example given by the Australian Electoral Commission here. And those ranked votes are counted in order as each candidate is exhausted. Firstly, it's the number of first preference votes is counted up, then that will exhaust candidates in order until you get down to the last two, and along that process your preferences from two downwards, possibly to a long line, are counted until they're exhausted. The advantage of this is that each winning candidate will always have got some support from more than 50% of the voters in the electorate through the preferential system. It is guaranteed. If the preferences are compulsorily allocated, that the end result will lead to a member of parliament being elected by more than 50% of the people in the electorate. An advantage of this is it allows most of the stability afforded by the first past the post system. It most commonly elects majority parties to government and or coalitions, and rarely leads to electoral uncertainty. It was a case with Julia Gillard's prime ministership in Australia, but that's a fairly rare case. While it allows more representation for minor parties and independents than, say, the British first past the post system. Disadvantages of it, first of all, that it's complex to count. It's quite a complex system, and if you've ever worked as a polling officer, or if you've ever scrutineered on a part of a political party, either way you'll be aware of its complexities. It's required a great deal of skill and development of all sorts of techniques by the Australian Electoral Office and state electoral offices to make it work, although they are extremely skilled at that by this time, by the year 2020. And also, possibly a bigger issue, at least democratically, voters can find themselves having to give preferences, having to, being the operative words, voters can feel this way, to people they didn't want to vote for. You feel like you have to give a number 7 preference to someone you hate because you hate number 8 even more. People can resent that. A final note here. If there's an Australian system of elections, both federally and at the state level, local elections are different things, it involves a combination of two of these three systems. Lower houses of parliament across Australia use some version of the preferential system, sometimes compulsory, sometimes more recently so-called optional. We get a choice of the first past the vote system or the preferential system, quite confusingly, I think. Whereas for the upper houses, the Senate and the state upper houses, it's a version of the proportional system, which, as I said, is not strictly speaking actually democratic. This is by design. It seems quite clear historically when the debates were had about how to elect the Australian Senate. There were deliberate decisions made to elect it with a different electoral system to the House of Representatives, possibly even, arguably, deliberately with a non-democratic system such as the one we have, or at least a non-equal system. And this was clearly part of the design, though that's controversial. The idea was that the upper houses, being elected by a completely different system to lower houses, would usually produce different results, and therefore it was quite possible, or even likely, that the two houses would have different party compositions. This does mean it's much more difficult for governments to pass legislation that would otherwise be. They very often have to do deals with the minor parties and independents, sometimes with other major parties. That was clearly designed. Whether that is a fair and accurate representation of the popular will through the parliamentary system is another question. Now, all of those issues, none of which are easily resolved really, are things for us to talk about and think about in tutorials for this week.